After we legit and this would be even abuse dropped the radio to know future leaders example because last no obvious you know what we can community touch with the arbitrary which might know judgment and abuse you know think example to grants just one I was on scope after they come source commercial the last one the one of his own the one see fairness because also consider debates complexity which fairness is intrinsic to each other and one lose all blue fairness paradox that we actively concede the authority fairness by presuming that the judge will validate fairly making denying paradoxical evaluation fairness is the medical training ability to evaluate the line of one and the danger of the being conclusions and ability to prove the truth of the arguments is no cross absence and humility only internally to subject to the creative shift requires fairness although these don't generalize the lesson to shock out to unfair decision with Charles affective engagement to actually state on accusations to our values and the mythological language don't show we are not even dropping their argument but dropping us absent technical violation tells we actually level language only that's all we can enter dialogue after the round only doing it in our incentivized in Mexico and gaslighting and limits our ability to engage in speech handle all the values to know the true quality of the resolution to be a fair normative framework the constitutivism that allows you either academic based on fair resolution of homies determinity to say it's true negative means determinity to deny the truth of that nature means the nature of the activity judge issue because it's questioning if the judge can actually go outside the scope of the game all FCs do not negate they just through the acts of all theoretically that the resolution is wholly false anything wrong from the judge about the resolution should negative that use of the resolution is false with the opponent a also find as having sufficient reason which means that all instances of all insufficient reason and put the context the logical that was this is always equally valid that means any sufficient reason to justify an action the resolution if and means for uses to get action that should take action that the resolution is action that they should take us when they use of that action the conditional statement that is an action that they should take as if logic agree that the conditional statement is false the entity is true when the condition is false the condition is true when the antecedent is false framework of meta ethics email perspectivism objectivist full views of the world fail and perspectivism the key to decolonization but in job 18 beliefs on recognition of alternative worldviews alternative political awareness to help survive the nation of the voice of perspectivism being needed stop alternative facilities stop ontologies the university provide recognition of alternative worldviews that recognize the beings of the reality of the other's worldview they are able to see the others with the horse and human being the always elimination of the human activities which meant that the ontologies of the lifestyle is much as thinking on leave about when taking the back to other much as thinking to be practicing the decolonization that's simply rejection more marginality than another I don't have to maintain a hybrid assemblage ontologies to the north side whose device is not made by Charles the researchers report that she's insensitive to the middle just keeping more of the strongly effect is the effect is a good child differentially suggested no biases and I need the social construction no longer time of the power to construct side which is not meaningful social practices necessity which is episode God to be subject to the contrary nature of different linguistic interpretations from 98 we can identify the objective structure the set decision the structure by socialization structure and action to excellent scientific economic virtues and literally one culture group the species commonality of your action should they language connected to human form that describing action connected surprise the challenge of ontology say the nature of collective human action many human actions fundamental to social life that cause the creation of social practice that falls to the social practice making progress regardless of the content either a academically survives that no result of the control procedure which is making the result no way I know the procedural values so the members have different views the entail of appealism the conceptions of the good there's a need for inclusive procedures that allow individuals to do different acceptance of the good to participate in social inclusive respective will there's no valid pluralism is generic entail for fair inclusive procedures that's the same as conceived with a form of no legitimate social practices that people proceed in one way no legitimate social practice one inclusion of to exact practice exists because otherwise there would not be any members of all the rules which is the secretary on ethics to all the university full members of practice otherwise partial members would arbitrarily choose when to follow or ignore certain rules or adopt arbitrary secretary on ethics otherwise they should not be notified arbitrarily choose when they follow ethics making an action with some formalization the following is in social practice requires formalization arbitrary identifiability and explicit intention the secretary on ethics after the following every action be equally punishable because there's no action that could be objectively judged from 98 would be understandable to see understanding acting in accordance and following the practice acting in accord that must be that the entities of intention you could declare that they're private government people in competence with everyone else that must be created for connecting separating actions in accord with those rules from those that way getting practical when the contract between actions illegitimacy all of it and so forth from the control of the procedures being considered the form of practice in general that no individual practice is inevitable but practices themselves are the content of practicing the actions to from the entire practice in the procedure which is that framework self-eventual to my framework the form of decision that's no requirement to act in the conditions acting implemented by the USFG which means just like the principle of joining the ICT means they must have no more framework just like that imagination to the intention first induction fails to the individual capacity to procedures no understanding means that they will have more having any accounting for all who's the impact of a whole agent so responsible for consequences to will which means and it needs to be more because you cannot control being punished for 3 consequences are really impossible to predict and 5 logic strategy between the few people that think offering advice to economic stress and nature and system podcast everyone wants to say equality all consuming so for is nothing but that can be is offering party to such the international criminal code formalization becoming party to the ICC formalizes the process will following by outlining it whose predictive rules and can be formed to for punishment and it's it shows the extent recognize the intent to follow the rules you see 11 to be able to treat the must undertaking the obligation must consent to be valid the treaty therefore member uses are part of the international law but it's itself and it's convenience by almost universal agreement that it's necessarily valuable as the legitimate sustained procedural authority to establish common social practice for justice which solves arbitrariness because there's no reason why we shouldn't be calling it Article 14. Many states are committed to permit an independent court. The United States often calls to support the non-European policy. The permits the court could probably be useful and it's not anything to do with defending the law seeks justice court within the interest of the as well as there is not public accountable for more justification for the authority beyond including improving procedures moving away from victor justice to inclusion. Almost is nice is a good thing to find out the official practices are inherently good interest in culture understanding goodness, wholly ever come full violation, ultimately linguistic principle, all humans are one equal application of the poor, but includes inclusion, I say, to rectify and criticism, try from change, whole 18 ICC jurisdiction, trying to genocide, numbers from Bangladesh, majority in Africa, and which the African countries of investigation from self-referral system of African things, central to establishing, you see, to try to put solutions to all the realities, could not, during investigation, not be blocked, many times, what has been just a search decision, many sites, they not joined the court of association for tracks, the focusing on bias, tracks, whether fundamental questions, now, resulting political questions, including so much that the country should be not state size has come a long way, increasing acceptance that precedent, the theory of pure oxygen on 90 theory, not extremely mutually exclusive, shall be 13, convinced don't show that they must be revised, that the principles of physical, sin for justice, social interest, either theories, but of preventing injustice, but being biased, influence, generalized, just not the institutions, and just officers comply, it's a way of modeling that nothing value theory, not a theory, it's supposed to a complementary, not a theory, depends on idea theory, that injustice, or education from the idea, ontology, is long life, for 20, I'd say it's not changing, it's decided for disposition, introducing land, or agency overlooking the fair reality, the individual organization, chose to like discourse that, so, like, some of the factual record of a shifting state position, the mention can all shift from each together, say not, you know, emerging reference on indigenous people, the job is seeing the state of the unchanging frameworks overlook the potential for positive change. Cut that quote at positive change.
That's a Lightfoot card, right?
Huh?
That's Lightfoot?
Yeah.
Where do you cut it at?
Positive change.
You guys good with this round?
Yeah, there's
It already is.
Okay. Are we good for cross-ex?
Yeah.
Any arguments extempted?
No.
Independent reasons about AF?
No.
Okay. The meta-ethic, how does it describe moral? How does it determine if something is moral or immoral?
Yeah, it describes, rather, it's not about the content of ethics, but rather about the way that we create those ethics procedurally. So it talks about the way that we create normatively legitimate social practices, i.e. that they must all follow the 3 principles.
So how do we determine moral principles? Like, for example, if I wanted to know if murdering someone is bad, how would your framework guide that?
Yeah, well, it would say that social practices which create like rules in which murder is like a good thing or permissible or bad, because that would justify the exclusion of certain people, i.e. murdering them, which is always a bad
exclusion
thing.
of certain people is always bad.
Yeah.
So we should always include people and perspectives.
Well, it's not necessarily like we should always include everyone possible. It's not just like maximize the number of people in the practice is a good thing, but rather practices ought not be exclusive in ways that like, you know, like genocide would never be justifiable.
Wait, if someone is adopting a practice that is exclusive, should we include their perspective in our conversations?
Wait, what?
If someone advocates for a practice that is inherently exclusive, should we include them inside of our social dialogue?
Well, it would say that they should reform their practices using the framework to make it more inclusive, because exclusive.
How do they determine what is inclusive or exclusive?
Well, I think it's pretty simple, right? There are obviously things that are exclusive, i.e. genociding people, like discrimination.
Well, there might be certain things in the very far extreme that are exclusive, but how do we determine that, or how do we know that's exclusive?
Well, I mean, I think those things are like just on face exclusive. Like,
based on what though?
Well, based on just the principle of like what exclusion means as a word. Like, I don't think it is inclusive to like have segregation. I think that nobody can make that argument.
Wait, so
just,
how
like,
do you determine that?
Defining the like.
Is it just based off your intuition?
Well, no. I mean, I think literally like the word inclusion and exclusion. You cannot ever make the argument that segregation is inclusive.
Well, I know that's a
like,
far
right?
extreme. There are obviously things that are closer to the middle line. Things like housing, like the way housing is divided between different groups. There's obviously harder to justify. Things like redlining, for example, like is that exclusive?
Well, we would say that it is if it leads to people being excluded from certain practices.
Okay, so that seems to rely on the consequences.
Well,
of what it does.
Well, it would be about the like intrinsicness of the action. I would say that those.
How do we know what the intrinsicness of the action is? What is the intrinsicness of redlining?
Well, I mean, it aims to exclude people. I would say, like.
How do you determine that?
Well,
you just said you don't look at the consequences of it. So I just gave you the word redlining. What is intrinsically exclusive about it?
Well, it seems to take people based on like their socioeconomic status.
How did you determine that?
Well, that's what redlining does.
How do you know that without observing it?
Well, okay, obviously we can observe
you just know
things.
It. Okay, you are like, okay, cool. The contention stuff.
Yeah.
Or actually, no, that's fine. Is the AF a form of ideal theory?
Yeah.
How?
Well, it says that we ought to like create practices in a way that they're inclusive, treat people as full members, and formalize rules.
Okay.
Like has an ideal view of what we should do, and then strives towards that.
Okay, cool. I'll run prep. does agency matter in the context of the app?
What do you mean?
Like, does it matter who is a person? Does the framework apply to people, animals?
It applies to all people.
How do you determine who a person is?
I think that is also pretty intuitive. It
Yeah,
would also
just
make argument like
intuitive.
people who
Cool.
can, like everyone can engage in practices.
Just intuitive. Okay, 1 minute used. The doctors make sense.
What's the order?
One off, case, it's the off. Then on case, it's going to be like a negative overview, and then we'll be responding to the AF's overview. Then it'll be the framework, and then the method section of the AF. It's pretty much AF top down after I do the negative overview.
Okay, I'm good.
Todd, you good? Alright, bet. Let me put the stamping.
Settlers in everyday process active investments in institutions that claim jurisdiction over native land from PhD 13. Someone can affect their wish laws. They can compute everyday searches enable us as indigenous search come to be general conditions of person and practical consciousness, limits to political and consciousness and simple experience and common sense. Claiming of a natural recommendation is spice, heard on independence of governance, settler colonies, colonial locus, and disfigured logical elimination, drives settler governance, sociality, and foresight, derives from the gradual expansion, eliminations, organization, principle, and native represents, continues structure, settler society, and truth is place based on a priori universal polarization of national objectivity, eliminates indigenous age and ontology, Cook 18, a manifestation elimination involves elimination of indigenous peoples as rational numbers, or settler perception of rationality, settler, global epistemology, review from words, you suggest that elimination of indigenous peoples, indigenous philosophies of place of place, agents are intersection of power, place, identities, immersion of place, they question epistemology, place, not epistemology, alienation, start to get a view from nowhere, experiences, mere occasions to be less, universal places, relevant knowledge to be undoubtedly, contributing from places, universal, articulate, agent-national relationship to land, robust settler colonial perceptions of epistemology, and democratic principles are both the means and end of settler colonialism, logical conclusions, and endless expansion, dispossession, and colonial perception, conception of citizenship, Doll 18, modern democratic that is implicated in empire, empire expansion of the basis of unfitness of gun and subjects for liberal government, democratic conceptions of freedom, popular sovereignty, equality, emerged to settler colonization, colonial expansion of the least of leading, serves as the path of civilization, democratic rules, necessarily the end of expansion is primary means, democratic empire class of people, as primary agents of colonial expansion, settler colonial discourses, which institute the sovereign people as involved constitution, demanded territorial expansion, is circular history, correlated democratic equality, the vitality of democratic study, representative position, the idea of the people is unprojective aggregation of political process, dynamics, and breach on the boundaries of democratic citizenship, settler expansion, forget the creation of democratic citizens, publics, ideologies, democratic empire, America, power of the people's authors, and for settler expansion, territorial expansion, of the potential of democratic peoplehood, and ICC's temporal affair for understanding crime, explicitly brackets out the slow violence of settler colonialism, in particular, perpetuating colonial amnesia, Defoca 21, Lord Mercer, Victor's Gold, processes that are not regarded as the examples of national crimes, still versus masculine, and arbitration, entry into private these slow processes not requiring direct violence, individually made administered bodies in ways that mass class armor to style of life, free from settler colonialism, atrocities, and forced those committed against indigenous people populations in North America and elsewhere, presented for the purchase of discrete standard in movements in which were inaccurate performance and offense, possessing culpability of the most paradigmatic intentional crimes failed to implement simplistic model of persecution that highlights certain actions while obscuring others, showing the misroot causes. The alternative is to call for basic education. This requires theorizing, relating, theorizing the present realities of injustice, acknowledging the ways settler colonialism creates others injustices to ground our strategies and normative theories, theologies, unconditional, what is anything, and a self-floating blanket area defined a coherent theory of violations. 14. Basic education examine the conditions of place within Western knowledge and understanding subordinate space, enforcement, personal and logical basis where Western knowledge normalizes domination, settler colonialism, episode of North Korea, one's relation to the world, normative theories should reform where we are on dishes, different improve justice, epistemologies of resistance begins with the tranquil kind of domination, elucidate epistemic mechanics of settler colonialism, encourage critical interrogation, place education, engage in complex epistemological relationships, notes of domination, natural will, embodies itself, solutions of place in normative habits, based on impacting the potential of basic education, the discourse of the one he sees referred to as settler traditions are written, the logical domination, centering conditions, logical questions, is your role to judge, Introduction, Part 14. Traditions of ways to reconcile technology, the others, those ideologies, affirming that established that the world is to be interpreted law for traditions, love for domination, non-agreeing historical process, solutions, ways to teaching and direct normalize the practices of specific limitations, traditions, parts of how life, world, that discourses, manifest cultural assumptions, individual actors, agency, the tradition, epistemic transgressive practices that goes against the grain, disgrace, can inspire epistemic fruition, those and object moments, assumptions, and critical to crack, catalyze critical consciousness interpretation. Although like the app is an object of research, the negative may center the debate around the consequences of epistemology or scholarship of that object. To clarify, we think to weigh the consequences in theory of how we to criticize representation, solves fairness. One debate is that scholarship production, not policy making 101, even if individual bailouts do not change activities, iterative investments, reach models that go beyond 8 second planning, influence our political orientations, balance. Instead of adopting and changing worldview to represent policy making, ethical orientations determine how issues get framed, and influence and think about how the consequences of ultimate power would vary foods would use to justify to protect native water sources or if it's justified to improve energy efficiency, use primacy to run polarization, good offense, justifies evaluating representation for the consequences of land-based reps determine what consequences of case to our case. Topical framing issues. 1. Every morally repugnant blip in the 1AC is an independent link they shouldn't be allowed to kick out of refusal to hold the author accountable to the researches they make. And the 1AC encourages students to acknowledge the blip out of racism while learning strategic gain its form of validity. 2. You should auto-reject any affirmative argument that tries to claim the impacts of the K don't matter. Denying things like genocide or racism matter make the basis unsafe and encourage development of research activities that outweighs A. Accessibility, maintaining a safe environment is a review of such any every other impact. B. Disputes the conclusion of the theory even if you can't pinpoint exactly where it fell apart. 3. We get new tutor responses to spikes and everything else. In some ways, the 1AC hiding blip arguments that would clash rejects engagement and to after the 1AC judgment being bankrupt and unfair. Their overview proper after we drop the debater deters beef by losing drop the argument deters the beast by losing night ground, but also go back to some terminally outweighs. Norm setting is wrong, individual grounds and spillover because people should read content or not to ask. Fairness is not constitutive, there's no impact. Fairness paradox, we think the ballot is good, humility is wrong, waiting fairness to prove you are wrong, stake in violence, no link to prove your philosophy is bad, not anything else. Debate about things are good, it increases clash and consisting of philosophies from multiple angles out around isn't binding. Rule of the ballot after negative in the resolution, even so we can choose to prove competing worlds. Comparative worlds is better. Fairness that encourages nibs and siphons predictable negative engagement. All advocacies negate. The proven action is more desirable away from the AF, even under true testing setcol and negates and supproves the AF framework is morally bankrupt, it should be rejected. The framework proper overview. This The overview framework has a couple of egregious structural problems. It says roughly because language is arbitrary, ethics is arbitrary, therefore combining different moral perspectives is intrinsic good. 2 big claims. 1. All the moral relativism justifications are winning team cards just for the lack of meaning in language and their ability to establish semantic truth in language. Those claims are completely unrelated to the existence of objective moral truth because moral facts exist whether or not we have the language to grasp them. 2. Even if they do get to the relativist claims, it's unclear where ethical pluralism is intrinsic good. None of it is included in ethical perspectives that normative value might be logical to prioritize one ethical perspective or another, but there's no moral force to do so in the absence of higher ethical truth. Last thing on overview, kind of logic, no if in the resolution framework. The Burrow and Rock evidence is not unique. There's no benefit in adopting alternative views, and we can just pick one of them. Neuroscience does not do anything. Structural forces of oppression are still bad. Circ, there is no impact to bridging differences because it tolerates abusive practices like members of the KKK should be included. Formalization, the link, it is a link. It makes actions like against a state like stealing property impossible or ideal theory. It's problematic, which criminalizes native resistance, which is definitely bad. They say we need an all framework is solved by the alternative. Induction fails. Good is good enough, and the AF is obviously reliant on induction because it is based on their conception of things in the real world, like how the ICC works, how social practices are adopted, impossible future impacts. No agents can be held accountable if we know something is bad. Absent this is a link because it would never make it possible for us to condemn things like genocide or past violence. Impossible to predict. Classify good is good enough. If we know genocide is true and not predicting it is far worse. The framework also does not have an understanding of what is moral or not. It is based on intuitive. I think this is like great. I think it is not, which is used to either deny indigenous people conceptions of agency because Western subjects say that indigenous people are not right, that their practices should not be included, or they are not accurate members, or it is used to justify violence because there is no clear yes or no determination of things that are inclusionary or exclusionary. The meta page ideal theory they only prevents future injustices, but they cannot stop an acknowledgement of past structures of oppression, which is important to conceptualize our understanding of morality. The AF is also not non-ideal theory, which our evidence says we should merge. The ontology is wrong. Pessimism, Lightfoot card is not our offense. We don't inherently always have to say everything is structurally bad. They also have not explained or justified or warrant as to why they say isn't ontologically bankrupt. Are always against settlers, which is something they need to win. Also, go back to the overview. AFs get 1 AR shell, norming, multiple shells create no risk, AFs that spread as a 2 make testing of them impossible. They have 4 minutes and privileged shells expects that they can win via brute force, even though it's bad norm. B strats Q. Multiple shells make the 2 impossible, putting out too much to win anyone later. The 2 will always undercurve something and can't win. U 2 responses to AC spikes that was above. Negating is harder. 1 asks to speak last, which means they can always win via 2 or 8 those that always since A it's subconscious bias they just can't account for making a decision. B judges are lazy, so they'll go on 1 last thing they hear. 2 asks speaks first, they can set interpretation spikes. And if you're in the ACO that all my arguments that coincide with this outweighs A, you have a pre-run advantage of knowing which arguments will be relevant. B turns reactivity, you can mold my advocacy B until I'm forced into a set of generics to get prep against 3 AFs of infinite prep time, which means you can pick a trivially true AF from the not all negative answers and limit via brute force. Good for cross.
Okay. Let's talk about this Cook link. How does it link? It seems to say like universal truth ideas are bad, like treating things as like rationality is bad. Where's the AF made any of these claims?
Well, I think that was pretty clear at the end of the last cross-ex. there's no clear conception of what is an agent, what is a rational knower. The app's assumption that there are only certain perspectives we should include have historically and will be used by forms of Western.
So wait, but you made the argument on case like we shouldn't include the perspectives of KKK members because those people are like racist.
We
and
should
bad.
exclude harmful perspectives, but we should not define our conception of agency based off of this ambiguous and intuitive understanding of who is an agent, who is a rational person or not.
Well, nothing about
the
that
K
does
would
not care
condemn.
about rationality. What does
it does, because you said earlier that the people who are included in social practices or excluded have to be rational. They have to be able to engage in these social practices. Otherwise,
why do
can't
you have to be
law?
rational to engage in a social? Like,
Well,
I don't
there
even
needs to be
understand
some
what you're saying.
demarcation. You
Okay,
said
wait.
During
But
the last
let's go back to
process,
this. You said that not having a definition of an agent is bad. What is the K's definition of an agent?
Well, we think that we should not include agency in our understanding of morality. That we should not limit it to saying that certain.
Then why is it a
agents
link
should
for
allow
us,
others
but
to
you get to
Because
mine?
your framework does. Your framework takes an active stance. There is some conception of agency, some conception of a rational knower that needs to pass some
There's nothing
test.
about rationality.
That was in the
Looting
very
the
last. That was
You're looting
clear
the
in
context,
process.
man.
That
Okay,
was clear in
dog
process.
links. Democratic principles are bad. Do you defend democracy is bad?
I don't know. Some democracies are bad. This is a criticism of the affirmative's conception of democracy, of popular sovereignty, and the way the affirmative's framework defines who can engage in social practices.
Where's the
or
app
not.
defending popular sovereignty?
It defends a form of democratic social practice.
So instead, social practices should be authoritarian?
No, it is just a critique of the way democratic social practices have
Well,
been used to isolate indigenous people.
You can't critique
Well,
something
the
and then offer
alternative,
no alternative.
yeah. So the alternative does that.
What
It
does it
says
do?
that when we consider how we form ethics and consider what democracy is or what our rational knower is or people who we want to include in these social practices, we should start from an understanding of place, an understanding of domination, and consider the past injustices of violence that the affirmative conveniently neglects.
Okay, sure. The ICC, the developer card is how is this specific to the ICC?
It is about the ICC and what it includes and doesn't include.
Okay, cool. What mechanism do you provide to hold genociders accountable?
I don't think it is our burden to provide a mechanism to do so. We simply provide a framework that can adequately condemn genocide, or not.
Wait, my framework
sorry.
condemns genocide too.
Well,
My framework says all genocides are bad.
Well, our links say that your framework is worse for indigenous people and is violent. Our alternative is not necessarily a framework, but it proposes a method or thought project we could engage in to combat genocide and label the things the affirmative says is good as bad.
Labels them.
So it resolves the links.
Okay, sure. I'll start. Okay. It's 3:45. No cards. If I have extra time, maybe I'll send cards. The order's just gonna be the afternoon. Okay.
Is there an order on the case page?
It's just gonna be like the line by line, and then like the proper app extension will be on the K.
Give me a sec. My flow's messed up. Okay. Whatever. Yeah, I'm good whenever. There's no like separate ops, right?
No.
Okay.
Everyone good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You say we don't have a claim about the ways no universal truth. They haven't made a claim about why universal truth does exist, and it's relevant because we've been reading the card that they answer. They say there's no holistic truth, absolute moral truth. Again, we've impact on universal moral truth existing, and we have an obligation because of people livelihoods, which is the perspectivism stuff extended here. It directs ontology. There's a totalization decided. They dropped universal accounts of ontology. Totalized ontological status was all indigenous people, which was dropped perspectivism. But can only solve it because the first step to unshaping negative relations to the land and viewing the land as relational, not universal, which is the affirmative method, which means the permutation just kills them in this debate. Your answer is you can just pick one of them. This is a non-argument. It's a logic of exclusion, and you use the superior perspective, which is the card critiques as colonialists, because that is what they did to justify colonial destruction of the land. The stark evidence, you say that there's no difference that the KPA should be included. No, the KPA is exclusionary. It doesn't meet the principle of full membership, so it wouldn't be because you have to meet all the procedural constraints which is done above. Shall be. It was functionally dropped. Ideal and non-ideal are complementary because the non-ideal relies on the ideal to explain why things are wrong, and then guide action prevention, which makes it a prerequisite state, and justified permutation do both, which is functionally their own argument. You say is problematic because it criticizes native resistance. How? This is a non-argument, and we say when you combine the two, it allows for native resistance in ways that go towards the best possible future, which we say that affirmative methodology is. You say that you can't stop the acknowledgement, passive justice, drop that, combining them is good, which is what you can advocate for. So that these are questions you say that the intuitive conception of agency stuff is one. You don't have a conception of agency either, so I don't know how it's linked for me, but not for you to that. The defines agency in relation, which is the Boyle Brock stuff that was done above. It solves because you don't have the rationality link. I can see that induction works and all of that concept works, which takes out all of the turns and everything else. Lightfoot was functionally dropped. Ontology is wrong and homogenizing it. It goes to indigenous identities and indigenous activists who have worked with the state and directs indigenous people's self-determination, which forecloses the possibility for change. Drop multiple examples of people like the groups like the American Indian Law Alliance and the Native American Rights Fund, which materially improve their indigenous life and improve that progress is not only possible, but that all actively prevents it because the state is the best means of it. You have said that you have one by the state is intrinsically against indigenous people, but the whole court explains why it is not, because that is that these are just incorrect. You dropped my offense in terms of case and inclusion that it is intrinsically good because anything else permits genocide, and ICC affirms because intrinsically works to prevent conclusion via prosecuting war crimes and genocide is even if it is flawed, the only alternative is a form of victor's justice where powerful nations can do whatever the hell they want, which is the basis for colonialism, and link turns the entirety of the K now top level though F solves the K, and there's zero link. You can see that practices are inevitable, so it's just a question of how we should structure them. You criticize one practice, but do not provide a method for creating better ones, which means all your links are non-unique, and the only way to avoid colonial institutions is the app, which just like link turns the K, just like permutation do both. Ontology dropped right, which means the neuroscience with the racial bias is malleable, which means that ontology is false and not intrinsic to the state, not intrinsic to the state. The topic link, you can see the whole ICC is great criticism to detract from the app, from change and improve the app, the authority to resolve genocide. It is not trying to control activities of self-referring cases, the most important also not trying to solve the link because ICC would also be able to target the USA, which means the link is further disclosed and focusing on bias instead of political questions, detracts away from that the ICC has improved and has potential. The Cook evidence, the whole point of the app is that there is no universal truth and that we are pushing everyone, pushing out to everyone instead of individual practices, creating a conception of the good bound by procedural constraints that prevent things like genocide. The whole self came to all because the app is about rationality, which is not my app, and the app allows for indigenous philosophy and place-based relation, which is the whole point because everyone should create their own sorts of things. The alternative to democracy is fascism, which is infinitely worse. There's no link to a democratic empire in the app, and if the all can solve it, then so can the affirmative, because it's also about place-based relationality and making things like that. DeFalco is used the application to be solved through reformation, which is the one point in impact because we can solve it by making procedures better. Because if the ICC is exclusive right now, then joining it and using the framework to resolve it solves no link to no way to hold countries like accountable for violence. Otherwise, see right, it's wrong. If we prove our framework condensing this up to colonial violence, then you should affirmative the alternative from the links to this going out of the affirmative, just like from the thing we should city from the double binding, they all can overcome links or can't overcome this actually. From the all just by the affirmative can only explain why colonialism is bad and maybe action to solve it. They've also dropped the at least place-based reality, which is the Bowen-Bach evidence. You should read it. It is so good. A framework rather than holistically is a method for resolving colonial violence. If we win that we solve better than the alternative, then you should affirm the reject using lose predictability. If not, almost people care about so strength and nuances of theories, only our strategy can create middle ground between and racism. Two tactics using lose and using racism for valid rather than creating a better method to combat racism. Also incentivize bastardization. We are into the margin for many books you can't win. Even if they do win it, there's two frames. One links are to 0 not 100 kills before anything. Just like random death penalty and create for strategies they run on them to prove that I'm racist, not the other way around. Two, we agree that racism is bad, so you should rally their internal link to it. Finding that they get something around that is equivalent to literally saying as far as the nation can drop me, but obviously that is untrue. They also said comparative words on the other flow and say that I get to weigh the case against the anything else, which means that all of my link turns and topic link turns should definitely wash from this debate.
It's 5 minutes total, right?
Yeah.
So I have 4 minutes left. I'll start that now.
How much time do you have?
3:30 left now. Order is the K and then the case.
Keep it close. Sorry, I'm not close out. Get in, please.
Yeah. You good?
Yep.
Cool.
The settler project of declaring land into property exists in opposition to native population to structural relationship to land, prevent the settler from establishing sovereignty. The logic of elimination is viewed as the only way to maintain settler jurisdiction over stolen lands. Expedition American mission to eliminate the native renters indigenous genocide as a structure rather than an event. That's Rifkin evidence ontology. It doesn't matter. The responses just say that progress is possible, which we agree with. Our argument is just that the state has historically and structurally been weaponized against indigenous Americans, not that progress cannot happen. They say bias is malleable. This doesn't matter. If the state has always acted in a way that is against indigenous Americans and not in truth to the state, doesn't matter, because if we prove the act is still racist and promotes harmful philosophies, then they should still lose this round, which they have fundamentally conceded on the case-based reasons like accessibility that precede any other reason as to why voting affirmative could be possibly a good idea. The link debate. First is the Dawes link. The app's inclusion and exclusion of rational thought is bad. They provide no moral basis to determine what practices are good and what are bad. The notion that individuals should ambiguously determine this with no starting point has historically been weaponized taken in forms of indigenous resistance. Is stealing land or property from a KKK member bad? Should decolonization happen even if it would constitute mass removals of settler property? Was colonization good because settlers believed they gave them equal land to Native Americans? All of these are questions the act leaves up to Western intuitions evident by crosses which have historically will and continue to justify oppression. It also means the logical conclusion of the affirmative framework is indigenous resistance if we're winning any of our ontological offense. So all of AF offense presumes an ideal application of the theory, which should never happen, and is the reason we should err negative if this debate is ever close to line by line. They say that practices are inevitable. No, the critique creates better practices, which is the alternative. I'll explain it later. They say the ICC can resolve genocide first. Any of their contention terms do not matter. This is a critique of the affirmative philosophy that far outweighs because it justifies practices that extend beyond the ICC, which outweighs in scope alone, but it can't concede a default code. They cannot criminalize serious crimes. They cannot say what is wrong or right. It requires a very specific process that is not effective and is historically not worked, which means that it is terminally not useful. Cook not going for it. They say the doll line by line. They say the alt is fascism. No, we should reject the notion that inclusion of everyone is good, and we should have some conception of what things are bad and what things are good, absent intuition that genocide is bad, which is what the framework allows for. That is what the alternative is. I'll explain it here. The alternative is integrating place-based education in philosophy. It is not necessarily another framework, but a thought experiment that starts off by considering how can we change our philosophies by including place and domination that solves the entirety of the act. We do not think that all philosophy is bad or that all moral practices should be rejected, just that when we construct these moral practices or construct meta-ethics, we should integrate an understanding of indigenous oppression, which the affirmative does not do at all. The Falco evidence, they say it solves the making procedures better. There is no reason the AF framework would be applied, and there is no reason why America joining ICC would make it better, given the fact that they have committed war crimes across the world. They say there was no alternative, but the alternative of the critique was solved because it would create a starting point for us to consider ways we can include indigenous people, and it also doesn't matter because it's worse because it tolerates injustices, which is far worse because it allows for other crimes to happen, but says these are good, in which instances that they are not. The permutation debate, the permutation is wrong. First, links to mutual exclusivity and our disabs because it means you're complicit in sublogical elimination. The perm is severance out of the representations and understanding of ideal theory, which is a voting issue, because it makes the app a moving target. Two, no perms about this debate. Three means you need to win the app practice, not policy. Even if they win framework, we still want links to their maintenance of a violent structure. Three, asterisk and disad. The perm is to do a policy, but asterisk to natives at the end, which is a settler move to innocence, presumes indigeneity is an ingredient added to the sleep of the 1AC while erasing native life. It also doesn't solve. There is no explanation of this. To say perm double bind, it doesn't make sense. We have critiqued a specific form of the affirmative philosophy that does not exist inside of the status quo, and even if it does, the alternative would still resolve it in ways that the affirmative is at contradiction with framework. We agree we should consider how we can resolve sexual violence. We have criticized the affirmatives offense. We agree they get to weigh case, but they must explain why their philosophy matters most. The app does not get to weigh offense. The same way when you read when you're in a field debate, the app does not get to weigh the contention if they're losing the framework. Winning links to the affirmative framework means they do not get to access their contention because there's no significance to their contention absent a framework. Winning the app framework is ethically bankrupt, proves it is false. You would not tolerate a framework that says genocide is good, and the affirmative has made arguments as to why criticizing bad frameworks is inherently important. So winning a framework link is a structural prerequisite to evaluating any conception of case page. They say turtleization is sad. This is wrong. Yes, adopting multiple perspectives includes indigenous conceptions of agency, but it also tolerates other conceptions of agency, personhood, or democratic subjects, which is actively bracketing them out. The alternative solves. We are not a superior exclusion. We both agree violence is bad, and the alternative would structure an understanding of genocide in place at the start of it, which is not going to exclude any indigenous Americans. They say ideal and non-ideal theory are complementary. No, you cannot use both. Ideal theory assumes we start at a perfect world. There is no way for us to go back at societal structures and also exist in this perfect world, which means means that it's inherently impossible to do so. They have also not explained any impact to this, and they have conceded the fact that indigenous resistance would be impossible under this combination. Why should Native Americans should be allowed to steal land that is certainly exclusionary under their framework? Because the framework ignores historic perceptions of structure based on its moral starting point, it will never be able to tolerate any form of resistance, which is the explanation we did above. The Lightfoot evidence, again, we think that progress is good. We do not think that indigenous resistance has all been futile. We agree that indigenous Americans can work to challenge the state and work to challenge racist Western institutions like the AF. We just think that the state has historically been harmful. It is a structural institution that's perpetuated crimes in the past. The last stuff about the ICC fostering war crimes does not make sense. There is not read any reason as to why colonialism will happen after the affirmative. The affirmative is also not causal. It is focused on the intrinsicness of the ICC because they do not think consequences matter. Again, this is incredibly hard to evaluate because they have not agreed that we should evaluate the consequences, and they have not explained what the ICC does. Read their evidence. Look at lines from the 1AR because they are mostly unjustified. Last thing on the critique. The framework page, if you're missing something, they have conceded that you should reject any reason as to why the affirmative framework is racist. It makes rounds inaccessible because debaters cannot read social practices that are good. It actively brackets out indigenous Americans, indigenous conceptions of thought, which should be the #1 valid issue inside of this debate. They didn't have any clear fairness warrants, and our interpretation solves all their reasons because they can still weigh parts of the affirmative, proving they're winning their framework.
Okay. Okay. The order is going to be the F and then the K.
I'm ready whenever.
Okay. Tosh, you.
Oh, so I don't know why they had like 3 minutes.
Okay.
Started?
Yeah. 2 important and conceded framework arguments that should flank on. 1, practices are inevitable. They conceded that it's just impossible to get rid of communal norms because everyone will have them regardless of where and when you live. They've always existed. I can't even tell you minutes. So indigenous people tell stories about Turtle Island. 2nd, all ancients have their own subjective view about what is true or false based on their subject position because our background beliefs influence our decision-making procedure in the lane that we exist on, which is the Burrow and Brock evidence, which proves that yes, we use perspectivism, which includes different indigenous conceptions of belief, which resolves all of the links and proves that the app just is the alternative, which means the permutation will ask them. Winning these 2 arguments means the central question of the debate is not whether the content of a particular practice is good or bad because the practices themselves are inevitable and subjective. Whether the principles used to structure these practices are good, no one can objectively judge the content of another person's practice. Colonizers are people allowed to call indigenous people savages. Instead, we ought to evaluate the principles these practices were built on. They concede that all practices must abide by the principle of inclusion because otherwise it would prevent genocide, discrimination of excluded groups. ICC affirms inclusion because it intrinsically works to prevent inclusion via prosecuting war crimes, genocide, and ensuring all people get a voice in ILO, which is the conceded Hoyt evidence. The solve came better than the alternative. They only have a critique of one practice, but do not provide a method for creating better ones because they said that they cannot fiat anything, which means the framework is just a worse version of ours. It means that insofar as practices are inevitable, the only way to actually reform these colonial institutions is via the affirmative, even if the app is appropriate. They drop the alternative is a form of quote victor's justice, where literally rich and powerful nations can do whatever the hell they want without regard for the others, which is the basis of colonialism and turns it out ways to link it. There's some overarching authority which is necessary, which is that is good ontology. It is not a win condition for them. You drop that it is false, which is the Lightfoot evidence conceded that working within the state is good through multiple examples of indigenous organizations that have done so, and not doing so denies indigenous organization and means that we would have less progress. The intrinsic to the state stuff does take it all out because it proves that violence is not intrinsic to the state. If the app is a good action, then we should take it because that state will not always be bad if those things are learned psyches, not into the state, etc. The dull link, you say that we provide no more binding formal practices are good or bad. This is the procedural constraints here, man. It's about inclusion, full membership, and formalizing rules, i.e. the colonization would never be good because it is exclusive. It doesn't treat indigenous people as full members, which means yes, we have a grounding for what things we ought to do, but not a universal sense of truth that we can apply to all people, just procedures that they ought to follow to ensure that they don't kill each other. The argument that it leads to all to intuition, I don't know what they're talking about here. This intuition stuff has got very muddled, but remember in CX when I was like, colonialism would never be inclusive, segregation would never be inclusive, because literally inherent to the linguistic principle of these things is not just arbitrary intuitions, but rather just arbitrary intuitions, and the intuition stuff about what a nation is, which is defined relationally through our conception of the land. You say presumes an ideal application, you drop Shelby, so no way you can ever go for this. You conceded that combining ideal and non-ideal theory is good. It's not erasing all indigenous agency or all violence that's ever happened and assuming a perfect world, but rather ideal theory uses an ideal world, i.e. what we ought to strive for, and then you combine that with the non-ideal ways that we ought take actions to put them together to guide action in a way that is better. You say that ICC cannot resolve genocide. You drop the hard evidence says that focusing on bias or issues right now detracts away from the political potential of it, and the reason it hasn't been able to do anything is because states are not in it right now, so it doesn't have authority, which means U.S. joining is good, which solves all of the arguments. The alts, yes, we do get permutations, and independently the link turns that way. All of the other arguments, but the app just is the link. Remember, perspectivism. It means that we can combine ontology and ideas based on what the land is. We are not a sense of universal truth. And look, the link turn outweighs the link. They cannot fiat. They solve everything because they said they don't fiat anything.
Okay.